Thanks, Lalit, for the kind introduction. So the way I think the best way to do this is I'll kind of proceed, but rather than leaving questions to the end, more than happy to take questions as we go. And if I'm going to cover it in a slide or two from that point, I might wait a few seconds, but otherwise, feel free to chime in as you see fit. The session is really for you guys, so whatever way works best for you, I'm happy to kind of play along. So with that, why don't we go right into it? I've probably got a lot more slides than I'll cover, and I think there's a provision for everybody to have the slides. So here we go. So just a quick outline of what I'm going to be covering. I have removed some of the frameworks and stuff I was going to discuss simply because there's two other people speaking, and I'm sure they're going to cover that, and I'm already probably over my time. So just a brief outlook at our firm. I'm not going to really go much into this slide, but we do a lot of international consulting. We especially work in the Canada, India, and Canada, Middle East corridors. We've helped a number of clients enter the Indian market, and we've helped some Middle East firms actually enter the Canadian market as well. In the last couple of years, we've added 2 more divisions into the firm. We have a Surge Solutions divisions now, which basically creates off-the-shelf scalable software solutions, which we've built working with various companies in many industries. So rather than having to do a consulting engagement, we have platforms that work on that side. And we also have a small capital division called Surge Capital, and we're starting to take positions in various companies that we find exceptionally promising. So let's get right into it and talk about strategy. Before I talk about what's a good strategy or how somebody can come up with one, let's get out of the way what is not a good strategy or what makes a bad strategy. So I'm just going to bring all these down and then we can kind of look into them. So sometimes people confuse strategy with things like goals or actions or tactics. For example, my strategy is to go international. Not really a strategy, which I'll tell you about in a few minutes. Or my strategy is to reduce costs. Or my strategy is to outsource my production. Or my strategy is to consolidate with one of my competitors. Those are all fine and dandy, and those are steps along the way, but I wouldn't really call any of those strategies on their own. And you'll see there's many things here which kind of play a part. There's one more there. So strategies are typically not overly complex. If you can't explain your strategy or write it down in a page or 2 or 3, it's probably that nobody within your firm or anybody else will even be able to kind of create the steps, or your firm will not be able to go through and execute on that strategy if it's that complex. But at the same side, or on the flip side of that coin, is strategies are typically not so obvious that anybody from the outside can look at it and say, oh yeah, I know exactly what the strategy is and can replicate it also. So there's some unique characteristics, you know, and a fine line between the two. So here's a definition of strategy from the Oxford Dictionary. There's 2 main ones. I think I haven't looked at the history of the word and the etymology, and maybe Professor Wittes can go into that, but I believe the term and the whole concept originated from military uses, probably a long time back. And it's been adopted over the years, and Michael Porter was one of the pioneers who actually used that and started using that phrase in terms of competitive strategy and competitive advantage and how companies can take advantage of various actions. So we're going to be focusing on the first one, which is, and I'll just read it out for everybody's benefit. It's a plan of action designed to achieve a long-term or overall aim. And that really encompasses all strategies. And there's many permutations, combinations of that definition. Some business people will use different terminology, but really that's the gist of it. Whether you're applying it to business or you're applying it to anything really. So that's a strategy. So let's go into what aspects exist in a good strategy. And you'll see I've tried to use opposites of the previous nouns or verbs with some adjustments, but see if they ring a tone with you guys or if you have any questions. So strategies are typically long-term. When a firm actually goes through the exercise of developing a strategy, it's not something that they're going to do on a biannual or yearly basis, or probably not even every 2 or 3 years. Simply because strategies that actually work, whether it's a transformation or whether it's a growth or it's a market entry or what have you, or operations or IT, they take many, many years to execute and fulfill. And so you don't go through this exercise. They're very long-term, they're far-reaching, overreaching sometimes. I can't even read what it says. But they do incorporate the goals. Okay, so they don't ignore the goals. They're not goals in and of themselves, but they do incorporate goals. Maybe implicitly, maybe explicitly. They incorporate tactics, or as I like to call, actions or steps as well. And they try to gain a competitive advantage. And later in my presentation, I'll go into specifically what are some of the differences and how the two relate to each other. They're typically at a macro level, so even within a division or silo within a corporation, strategies would be greater than just a singular part. You typically wouldn't, I mean you could, but you wouldn't see a competitive or corporate strategy developed for a small team. You could, somebody I guess could put one together, but the idea of that actually fulfilling the concepts of the corporation or fulfilling what the strategy was originally designed to do is probably not very likely. So they typically work on a larger scale or on a macro level. They're inevitable, and everybody know what that means? Or nobody know what that means?
Nobody can easily copy your strategy.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So if your strategy is so obvious or so simple that somebody can just watch what you're doing and copy it, that is not a very good strategy. Right? So good strategies have a unique characteristic that they're not very easy to copy, or maybe impossible to copy even. And we'll go into that a little bit later as well. So kind of related to that, they're rare in the sense that they're not extremely common. And what works for a particular organization, if it's developed correctly, will not typically work for another organization. Why? Because a correct strategy or a good strategy that the team or the company is capable of executing, where the goals are achievable in whatever time frame, it incorporates the culture of the organization, it incorporates their core competencies, et cetera, et cetera. So it's rare in the sense it's unique to that company usually. Again, it's not obvious, so some of this is overlap. It's valuable, okay? So strategies that actually are what I would call good do create value. And they usually begin with creating value for the customer, but they also create value for the organization. So strategies that do not create value are not good strategies typically. And and if you see organizations, and we all know a bunch of them, and I'll give some examples later, strategies that are executed where value is not created typically lead to either some form of damage or maybe even destruction of the company, or destruction of a division, or a significant loss of customer base. And the last one is, again, there's a subtlety in this, is that there is some level of simplicity to a strategy that's good, to a strategy that works, to a strategy that's tailored to the organization. In the sense that whoever works within it, who's been involved in the process, they can easily recognize what we're doing, the articulation, whether it's the CEO or whoever within the company is articulating or developing it. Everybody on the team understands very quickly what it is that they're doing. And when you hear it as an outsider, it will also sound somewhat simple to you. That doesn't mean you'll be able to do it or replicate it. So here's some examples of good strategies, and I'm going to take you through a little bit of an exercise. Yes, please.
Instead of the word simple, wouldn't you say the word elegance would have been a better word for it?
Sure. They can be elegant. Elegant has unique connotations.
That's right. Which
is why I didn't throw that word in. But a strategy may be very elegant. It may not be also. The next slide may be interesting to you. And let's see if anybody can pick out who said what and who these strategies belong to. So here's the first one. Let's go through it a little bit. I can't even read it, so. It's behind me, the slides. So this company developed kind of a two-pronged strategic approach. One was they set an overall goal for the entire enterprise, which is that no matter what division, no matter what region, no matter what product or service group, they would only compete, or they would only continue to run operations where they were first or second in that area globally. Okay, number one. But to achieve that, they set forth a series of smaller strategic plans around facilitation, expropriation, and appropriation. And I'm not going to go through the minutiae of the bullet points, but there's a quotation from the CEO of the corporation on the bottom. Can anybody guess who this is or who this was? Jack Welch, GE, exactly, right? But at the time, it was seen as very radical, right? But it worked, and it took a very, very long number of years to achieve the end result. Here's one that maybe as obvious or maybe not as obvious. So this company always starts with the customer in mind. And they don't do anything that does not achieve the direct result of adding value to the customer or the customer experience. That includes divesting themselves or stopping development of products that they don't see adding value to the customer, even if they're partway through or completed that product. Can anybody guess who this is? Apple, exactly, right? But if you didn't know, or if, I mean, maybe everybody can pick this out by just watching Apple, but you can see some of the subtle nuances of, none of those traits of bad strategies are very evident here, but many of the traits of the good strategies are all evident in both of these strategies. And you can do this exercise for any company out there that is outperforming their competitors, and you will see some similarities in how they operate. Let's quickly go through, again, there's a lot of detail here, I don't want to go through all of it, but let's go through some of the reasons why strategies fail. And it's not because the people are not smart or the people are not capable, or it's not necessarily that maybe the strategy was bad on its surface, but there's many things at play that come into play when you're executing a strategy, and that could be a reason. The competitive marketplace can change. A new competitor can enter the marketplace. Your product can become outdated. So many things can happen. Here's some of the ones that you may or may not be aware of. So the first reason is using an incorrect paradigm. Okay, and the example I gave is a hammer and a nail. If you're walking around with a hammer, you're looking for a nail, and we've all experienced colleagues or friends of ours or other ideas we've seen where there's solutions looking for a problem, right? But the really good strategies or the really successful corporations solve a problem first. They may have the solution to begin with, they may not have the solution, but it starts with the problem. So if you have a nail, search for a hammer. Just because you have a hammer, don't go around looking for a nail, right? Again, you can read through the rest of the slides, but that's kind of the main takeaway from this one. Seeking pseudo-precision. I'll give you an example of a pigeon and a human being. If you toss a coin in front of a person or a group of people, they will watch what happened with the coin on the previous toss. They'll think about what happened on the previous 5, 10, or 20 tosses. And they'll try to adjust what they think is going to happen next based on all of that. If you were able to fabricate a coin that always came up heads 60% of the time and did the same exercise with a pigeon, the pigeon would outperform the human every time. Why? The pigeon will say, I said heads and I got food. It'll do it again. I hit heads, I got food. I hit heads, I got food. It won't even go to tails ever. Why? Because it knows when it guesses heads and it happens to be heads, it gets food. Right? Very simple. But they've done this exercise in psychology and many, many types of decisions like this. Another one that we've all experienced is you see people that are deciding between two alternatives, A and B, and it's a 49-51 or a 51-49 decision, and people labor over these decisions. Which is the right one? I don't know, right? But when it comes to 90-10 decisions, they're very quick. And when you think about it, shouldn't they be spending most of that time on the 90-10 decision? Because if you get it wrong, look at the difference between those two alternatives. Whereas in the 51-49, maybe a 2% or 2 points one way or the other, right? But we typically do the opposite. So again, it's the precision that's been applied to trying to develop this is incorrect in my opinion. Here's a good one. Relying on anecdotes and stories. We've all been involved in team meetings and brainstorming sessions where the subject matter expert or the team says something and it's just taken at face value. It might be 100% correct, might be 100% wrong. There's been tons and tons of research done in this area over the last few years around what happens in groups. There's group thinking, there's various other dynamics that play a role in corporations or organizations going in the wrong direction for the organization. Why? Because somebody said something in the room and everybody just kind of followed their lead. Not to say they're always wrong, but they might not be right. So it's incumbent on everybody to kind of dig in and not just fall prey to these things. I'll give you a really good example. I don't remember the exact numbers, but you can all look it up on the internet. Everybody here probably recalls the Space Shuttle Challenger crash a few years ago where it crashed on re-entry. And this was the shuttle where during takeoff, a piece of debris hit the underside of the space shuttle and knocked one of the tiles off. And on re-entry, that became a weakness spot and it overheated and eventually led to the explosion of the space shuttle. When NASA was evaluating, actually during the orbit of the space shuttle, when NASA was evaluating how they could examine the underside of the shuttle, they knew that the space station had a camera I can't recall whether it was on the Canadarm or otherwise, but they knew there was a camera available in space where they could try to look at the underside of the shuttle. But one of the experts on that panel said that the resolution of that camera would not be sufficient to actually get a good look at the damage, whether it's suitable to bring the shuttle back into orbit or not. After the fact, when they looked at their diagnosis and examined this over about 2 years, they actually found that the resolution of the camera was something like 5 or 10 times greater than they actually needed. But again, an expert, subject matter expert, made a comment in the room, and that became de facto truth, and that was that, and everybody just moved forward. Right? This happens all the time in all kind of companies. Here's one. Assuming our strategy will work. If we did an exercise in this room about car companies or any other type of companies that people are working with, and said, so person A, you're the CEO of company A, and person B, you're the CEO of company B, and person C, you're the CEO of company C. And you did an exercise not talking to each other about, this is what you're going to do, what do you think your competitors are going to do, and person B, what do you think person C is going to do, right? Everybody thinks that people are going to react rationally, and when I do this, person B is going to do this, and person C is going to do this. Well, people don't incorporate that the person may not react the way you're thinking, or that your strategy may in fact not work, and you may have to change it halfway through because of something a competitor did or didn't do, in fact. So this kind of simulated exercise, or these types of war games that people play out, or they play, they try to come up with dynamic equilibria between different strategies and different tactics that corporations will take. It's dangerous. So if you just say, hey, here's what's going to happen, and if we do this, we expect the company to do this, or we expect our competitor to do that, it may not always work that way. I think I talked about the human nature one earlier. Anyways, let's go through this one. Not figuring out what it's about. This is really missing the mark on what is the actual issue or what is the problem at hand. And the key message in this slide is most problems or most issues or stories come with some kind of title associated, right? This is a marketing problem, or this is an operations problem, or this is a finance problem, or this is a political problem, right? Well, what if the title was wrong? Then what happens? Or what if the underlying issue is not what was the premise of the exercise, or not the context it was given in? That almost throws out all the work that comes after that, right? And so it's important, before we attack these problems or attack these challenges, to really look at what is actually going on, and does that make sense? What is going on underneath? And I think I talked about it on a previous slide, but people say, does the theory fit the reality, right? What if we played it in reverse and say, does the reality fit the theory, right? If you see some phenomenon that's occurring with your company or with your competitors and say, is that really how it's supposed to work? Is that how supply and demand works? And if it seems like it's the opposite of what's going on, there's probably something else going on there, right? And so it's kind of good to have that double check. And here's just some examples of strategies that were employed by huge global corporations, very smart management teams, very smart strategists and other managers involved, but they all failed. Some failed because they did illegal activities, some failed because other things happened, the regulatory regime changed, the competitors did different things. But we can all list dozens and dozens and dozens of companies all over the world. So again, strategies don't fail because of bad managers or bad executives or because they're not smart enough. But they make certain mistakes along the way, and then they get married and tied to these decisions, and before you know it, it's too late to turn it around. So we can go through the bottom line on good strategies, and here's really what it is. So good thinking, start with good thinking always. That leads to good decision making, which leads to good decisions, which leads to good strategies. A lot of people think strategies come first and decisions come later. But I said earlier, and if you agree with me, that a good strategy or a well-composed strategy actually incorporates many, 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 many decisions that occur in many parts of the corporation over a very long term. Then you'll see why I put strategies as coming after these good decisions, because you don't even know what strategy you have or what strategy you should have until you go down a road a certain degree. And that's when you can come up with it. If you just sit in your room and say, here's what my strategy is going to be, but you don't have your employees, or the employees have not been involved in the process, or you've never actually executed any steps along the way and you've just kind of ad hoc composed a strategy, the chance of you actually fulfilling the desired end result of that, or the likelihood of that strategy actually becoming executed as you've composed it, is highly unlikely. Okay, let's now talk a little bit about competitive advantage. So competitive advantage is a byproduct of a well-developed or well-executed strategy. Okay? And this is typically the end goal. Some form of competitive advantage should be, I would argue, the end goal of every good strategy. And there's two broad types, and you can put these into various areas of the corporation, whether it's IT, whether it's operations, whether it's marketing, or wherever you like. But there's two real types. One is differential and the other is comparative. Okay? Differential is creating or coming up with a competitive advantage that differentiates your product or service from your competitors. Okay? That's one humongous area of having a competitive advantage. For example, Apple, like we've all seen, and there's many, many companies in many industries that have a differential advantage. The second one is a comparative advantage, which is being able to produce the same good or a similar good at a lower cost. That doesn't mean you're necessarily selling it at a lower price, but because you have a lower cost, you've got greater leverage to play with your price, and you may be able to have higher margins than your competitors, or you may be able to sell it at a lower price, and even though your margins may be similar, you have a lower cost, you have a lower price that may allow you to gain market share. So these are really the two broad areas. There's some other ones, but these are the primary two. And how do you develop this? This we've kind of touched on, but let me kind of bring it together now. So the purple on the right side and the left side are the same one. So differential means you've created some product or service which is better, which is different, which provides some unique or enhanced value to your customer. And typically when that happens, you've elevated the willingness to pay of your customer. Okay? The second one is competitive, which is having lower costs, or comparative, which is having lower costs. And how you achieve these is really in two broad areas, but within them there's all kinds of activities and decisions and behavior that takes place. One is a superior competitive position, and the other is an operational effectiveness. And I'll go through in a couple of slides what I mean by those two. One is more enduring, the one on the left is more enduring in the sense that if you're able to actually achieve that, you will see that the financial implications of that, or the bottom line implications, or the business growth implications are more substantial, they last longer, they're more valuable to your customers. Whereas the operational effectiveness, it works, but it's typically less enduring. So here's kind of a diagram of how the two fit together. So the productivity frontier is really what you will achieve, or the goal is to get to that frontier, right? Which is kind of, you've got a cost position which you've tried to optimize as best as possible. So every corporation, if you work to drive down your costs, and if you also are able to differentiate your product, then you're really golden, because you've got the best of both worlds, right? And again, I'll talk about Apple, but Apple's is a fantastic example of this. They have amongst the highest prices in the industry across all of their products, yet they have some of the highest margins and lowest costs on a percentage basis. Okay, and so they're able to maybe even get right to the productivity frontier or very close to it. If you're working on the operational effectiveness side, then really you're playing within that curve, and you're trying to move closer to it. And there's, again, many things that corporations can do to get towards that boundary. So here's kind of just a simple chart on how this plays out in financial terms. So on the extreme left you have, let's just take an average industry competitor where they have a certain cost base and they have a certain willingness to pay of their customer, or the value created, right? So they're playing in that green to purple region, and where they actually stack up depends on their competitors, depends on what substitutes are available, et cetera, et cetera. You will see how the successfully differentiated competitor typically will extract greater value from the marketplace than the low-cost competitor, okay? Again, it's apples and oranges, and I'll give you an example of, if you looked at a very low-cost automotive producer, like Kia or Hyundai, with all due respect to where they operate, and you look at what is their profit per unit, or what is their gross profit, and you look at a luxury brand such as Lexus, or Mercedes, or BMW, or the extreme example, a company like Bentley or Rolls-Royce. On a per unit basis, or in any kind of equal apples to apples example, the luxury brands will gain far more revenue or profit or excess profit over any of the competitors that are in the low cost game, right? So the low cost game works really well when you have very high volume, right? And Walmart's a really good example of that. They have the lowest margins in the industry, but they have some of the highest total profits in the world. Why? Volume, right? So, and then the third example is a company that's done both. So that would be the Apple example I've been discussing. So here's just some examples from data gathered from various sources about. Yes.
Could I add?
Yeah.
I just the only add I was going to add there.
Somebody go
I think Walmart's almost getting to a place where they are almost Appleized. I'm making up words. Being that they're the supply chain and the cost, they've been able to push vendors down. I used to be a vendor of theirs. But also on the brand front, everything they've been doing and the way that they've presented their perception to the consumer is getting them to a place where, you know, they're viewed in the same light. That they're not just a place where they get cheap stuff. It's actually a really dynamic shopping experience where they're doing the things in the community, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, to your point, if you win on differentiation, you win on brand, you win.
Yeah, and the reason Walmart's able to do that is what's happened is with the downturn and other events, some of the typical target market that wouldn't necessarily shop at a Walmart has started to do that, and Walmart has realized that by differentiating the customer and tapping into some of those segments, that they can tap into that market. So what they've really done is created, you know, if you look at on a distribution of their customers, they're going after a distribution that may have been slightly on the tail, but it's moving towards their core group, right? And so within a Walmart, they will have the lowest price, lowest cost products you could get anywhere in the marketplace, but they will also have certain slightly luxury products or even luxury products that cater to some of these other segments, right? And eventually you will see a merging of those two, and it'll kind of, the tails will come closer to the main distribution that they work in.
And
at least that's their plan.
And the competitive entry from a Target will even force them into a different place.
Exactly.
And the consumer will win.
Exactly. Thank you, yeah. Sure, yes.
Could you give us example about the second, which is the largest buyer value generated and then the largest cost incurred? Could you give
A successful differentiated product?
Yeah.
Sure, I can think of many. Do you want one that doesn't have cost or also has cost? Just has differentiated product?
Yeah, just give us an example.
Okay, I can think of in the auto industry, if you look at any of the luxury automakers, they almost have a unique target audience that doesn't really slip away. There's very little, for example, you may have heard like a Mercedes customer is a Mercedes customer is a Mercedes customer. Yes, there are a certain percentage of customers that may compare that to other ones, but Mercedes knows that a significant portion of their customer base is extremely loyal and will stay with them for a very long time. BMW is a similar example. Lexus is a similar example. In the, if you give me an industry, I can think of another example for you. Apart from auto.
Well, you may say, give us a sector, give us an industry other than auto.
Consumer goods.
Consumer goods. Okay, so premium. Okay, so for example, consumer goods is too broad. You want to give me a smaller one?
Alcohol.
Alcohol. Okay, so
Spirits.
Spirits. Okay, so you have. Well, they're all differentiated. That's a toughie, right? But you have premium. But you have premium products within the consumer product, alcohol, spirit space, that whether it's through branding, whether it's through customer experience, whether it's through packaging, whether it's through the experience, there's so many aspects that play a role where they're able to charge a significant premium on price. Where is the taste that much different? We don't know. Is the cost of production that much higher? We don't know. But we do know that they charge a premium over their competitors and are able to maintain that over the long term, even actually grow that price premium. Right? I don't want to mention a particular name, but you can think of
single malt scotch.
Single malt scotch. Vodka is a very good example, right?
Great scotch. Great.
Right?
Taste.
And do you know how they differentiate? How they,
Sure. So they do, again, in simple layman's terms, they do something better. So what they do better, there's so many things I can tell you. So do they market and brand their product better than their competitors? Yes. Do they talk about their experience or what it is like to consume or be part of that community? Yes. Starbucks is a great example. When's the last time you heard anything or saw anything about Starbucks related to coffee? They actually hardly ever talk about their coffee. They talk about the experience of being in a Starbucks location, right? So much so that Starbucks is not even that worried about cannibalizing their own sales. They can put one down almost at every corner of every block in a financial core, and they know that the people in that building will come to the one in the bottom of that building and not go one block over to the other one, right? So they've been able to differentiate. Is Starbucks coffee that much better than a competitor? We don't know, it's subjective, right? But they've differentiated enough that they can charge a significant premium for their product that the other coffee producers or sellers, at least in the North American market, have not been able to achieve, right? And so what you have is really, you've got a dominant player, you've got the other guys who play in a cost game. They try to compete with each other and they release new products and it catches for a period of time, maybe they gain some traction. And then you've got the mom and pop players who are able to offer a very unique experience that's unique to that coffee shop. Maybe it's the owner, maybe it's the conversation, maybe it's the furniture, etc. Right? But that's another example. Does that help?
Do you think intellectual property will be the major?
I'm getting to that. Yes.
To
Yes.
differentiate?
Absolutely. That's one way people can do it, right?
Well,
But you asked about what is the intellectual property of a Scotch?
right.
I don't know, right?
And-
There's over 1,000 single malt producers,
Mhm.
right? We only get a handful in Canada, but so what differentiates? What allows one to charge X, where the other people are charging 0.5x or 0.3x, right? So here's just, the data is a little bit old, but you get an idea of profitability. So the bottom is operating income divided by assets. So you can see some industries are extremely good at driving up excess profits over a very long period of time, where other industries are not as good, right? I can give you, auto is kind of coming to mind tonight, I'm not sure why, but I'll give you an interesting example. Back in 2008, when you had some of the major North American firms going under, there was a data point published, which is that, I believe it was General Motors. It was either General Motors or Chrysler. They were losing something on the order of $1,200, losing $1,200 for every vehicle that they sold. Okay? So a normal person would think, well, why don't you just stop? Right? Stop selling cars, because at least you're not losing anything, right? Toyota, on the other hand, was extracting a profit in the order of $2,700 per vehicle. Okay? So that's a great example of differentiation, and you can see what it does. Right? Now, there's a lot of things within each of those organizations that leads to that kind of outcome. It wasn't a single step, or it wasn't a single kind of year or even 5 years. It was a much longer time frame. But differentiation allowed for, so the trick is really, differentiation allows for a larger gap between what profits or what revenues you can generate versus your competitors. You can do it the low cost method, but at least the data has shown that the excess profits you generate over your competitors will not be as great doing it that way versus doing it with a differential advantage. Okay. Here's an interesting one within two particular sectors, so the semiconductor industry and the airline industry, right? And you can, if you look down the list of these companies, left one is a little harder because most people don't see or touch or see the insides of what Intel does so differently than AMD. But the right one is pretty interesting, right? Most people have flown at least one or more of those airlines. And everybody knows Southwest does something interesting, or they invented something unique, versus Continental or US or Delta or some of the other ones that went bankrupt, and now some of them are going bankrupt for a second or third time, right? So let's talk a little bit about, I guess, to your question, how do you create a competitive advantage? So the first one we've already touched on is to do something better than your competitors. Seems obvious, but that's what it is. Yes, please.
So I had a comment about the remark of Chrysler when you're comparing Chrysler with Toyota. The quality was fundamental difference. People didn't want to buy Chrysler because it would stop in the middle of the road and get you nowhere. Whereas with Toyota, not only it was more reliable, you could trust it. So positioning comes in, but the fundamental quality of the product matters more than positioning or whatever gimmick you can play.
Okay, but how did, so the key question there is, and that's a good point, how did Toyota develop that? It wasn't overnight, it wasn't on the first crack at it, it wasn't that they didn't make mistakes. How was it that Toyota was not only able to create or grow an organization where that quality not only existed, but that message and the price premium associated with that message and that quality was in the marketplace and customers are willing to pay? That's the key here. What was it within Toyota? Toyota executed a whole slew of steps, and I mean, it would take, you know, a team of people days and days and days to probably go through what is all the things Toyota did. Hundreds and thousands of actions that were committed right from probably the lowest of the lowest employee to the CEO that led to them actually not only creating that competitive advantage, but having a sustained competitive advantage and having people willing to pay for that over a very long period of time, right? So it's not just simple, you know, we're going to create better cars. Okay, that doesn't mean anything, right? So that's actually the key point.
To build on that quickly, it's they got to work together. So you may know you have a better car or a better chocolate or a better piece of software, but if your consumer doesn't perceive it that way, through positioning exercise, and you, don't take this the wrong way, but like not again, you know, but like Southwest can't win the air game if they constantly build their brand just on nice people treating you as well when you get in the air. Because the airline business we knew for years had bad customer service, etc. Southwest had to create an actual transportation model too, to augment that, to then take their positioning to a new level. So you do have to have a great product, but if the positioning is really winning in the emotion game with the stakeholders, like he mentioned, from employee up to CEO, it's powerful.
Yeah, and I'll go just to add to that. They say that, since we're on the topic of marketing a little bit and positioning, in order to achieve a true position or where your intended product or service should be placed, the underlying, whatever that product or service is, has to deliver.
Yep.
It's not a marketing game. You can market whatever you like, but if your product or service doesn't deliver to what you've marketed, you will actually do more destruction than gain as a result of it, right? And so, not saying that they did, but just hypothetically speaking, if Chrysler goes and markets itself, I won't talk about today because they're producing very good cars now, but back a few years ago, if Chrysler went and said, our cars are as good as Toyota, or as good as Mercedes, or as good as anybody else that's actually doing well, and people bought the car and realized actually that's not true, right? They would have done a lot more damage than actually ended up happening, right? And what you do in that sense is you end up sometimes even eroding customer base to the point where it never comes back to you, right? So that's a key message. That brings me to one more comment. I don't know if any of you have heard, but the chief business officer of Google, a fellow named Nikesh Arora, speaks many places all over the world. He's made an interesting comment just a few months ago about Google. Everybody knows the 4 Ps of marketing, right? Product, price, placement, and promotion. So he says, he says Google is an interesting phenomenon because they throw away 3 of the 4 Ps. The only one they look at is product, right? They don't look at promotion, they don't look at price, they don't look at placement. Only product. Just on the basis of product and the value it provides their customers, they're able to I mean, everybody knows it's a low-cost environment because they've got scale, but they're able to generate significant differential competitive advantage. In fact, in many products, they're the only player in the world, right? Because of the value return, only on the basis of product. There's no promotion or anything else involved, right? So.
And the only build I have on that is they've been able to find a product which can take all the 4 Ps and build them into one execution, which is an online brand. So that's the beauty of online, is you can have that all packaged into one differentiated proposition.
So just to kind of my last 2 or 3 slides. So we've discussed do something better, right? So that's, you can do the same activities or similar activities, but do it better. Either there's something unique or different or better about your activities, or there's something unique or better about the result of those activities. Or you can do a different set of activities. Another way is to be more valuable or rare, right? So they're all kind of driving towards the same message. Do it better, create more value to your customers, and you will gain a competitive advantage. How you actually gain these is through good strategies or optimal strategies, right? And then there's some other considerations to look at here, which is, are there differences in resources or capabilities, right? Can Samsung or Acer or any other competitors of Apple do the same thing Apple can. In some things they probably can. In many things they cannot. Why? The organization is different, the culture is different, the capabilities are different, their technology base is different, their intellectual property is different. There's so many things that are different, right? And so this all plays a role, and this helps enable certain companies to develop strategies that work for them that they're able to execute. That same exceptional strategy put somewhere else may completely fail, right? So the key is that we all would like to go to is how do you go from a competitive advantage to a sustainable competitive advantage? And this ties in the gentleman's point from earlier, which is don't just be better, but be better and different, right? And that's a critical distinction. So this comes in, and the second one is be more valuable or rare and not easily copied, right? So you can look through some of the detail on the slide, but intellectual property is one way. Having a capability which is unique, which people cannot copy. No other company in the world can replicate Google's workforce, or Apple's workforce, or Mercedes or BMW, or Starbucks. You take any business that is, I would say, exceeding the average or exceeding the performance of their competitors, and if they're doing it over some significant period of time, then they've established a sustainable competitive advantage, right? And if it was so easy to replicate, somebody would have done it, but you can't, right? And so that's the next step. You go from a competitive advantage to a sustainable, sustained competitive advantage over a period of time. And that involves also continued innovation, right? You have to stay on the forefront, and you have to continue to innovate, because eventually people will start nipping at your heels and start catching up to what you're doing. So, just to wrap up, you've already seen this, and if you're able to execute and produce all of these and do it better than your competitors, then you will gain that competitive advantage, right? And the trick is, I don't know if you noticed on the previous one, the dotted line's on the way back, right? If they don't work, go back and reevaluate what it was, and if you get married to something and follow it through the end, it may be catastrophic, lead to the destruction. That's about it. Any other questions?
Hi, I just wanted to comment. We actually did a case study on the auto industry. It was actually GM that was losing money, and the reason why was basically they didn't pump the right amount of R&D at the time when it was needed, and the experience they didn't create the right experience for the driver. Therefore, through word of mouth, drivers were just were not accepting what GM was producing. Therefore, that's why they opted to choose another brand like Toyota. So
yeah, GM. I mean, everybody's read GM also has this kind of overhanging issue with medical coverage of retirees and pensions and other things, right?
Yeah.
And so that plays a role, right? But your point is well taken,
So
right?
it's all about strategy when you have to take care of certain aspects of the business, and if you're off, then it can have that detrimental effects. So
Exactly. And it's fluid, right? None of this is happening in a vacuum or in a black hole. This is in real life with real competitors, with new people producing products and services, and so it's not an easy game, which is why some exceptional companies with exceptional people fail, right? Yeah.
In Canada, apart from Walmart, there are places like which equally compete with Walmart on terms of prices and all. So why is that Walmart is so successful? Like, you know, even though there is so much of competition in terms of price and all.
Well, I don't have the numbers in front of me, so, but within those products, how much more successful Walmart is, or if it is in fact more, I don't know. But the most obvious answer that comes to mind is, whereas No Frills has, a very limited number of SKUs, right? So what is if you look at the average No Frills and the average Walmart, maybe No Frills will have 5, 7, 8% of the SKUs that a Walmart might have, okay? Even within the food or consumer goods segments, they may have far limited product base than a Walmart does. I'm just speculating, right? But those are some reasons. So if you look at the customer who's in that segment of the population who is attracted to that low cost, let's say grocery alternative, right? In addition to groceries, every family, everybody needs other products and other goods, right? So maybe it's the option of we can go to Walmart and buy all of those products as well as other products, whereas if we go to No Frills, we can only buy groceries, right? And so the value proposition for a No Frills has to be to some degree greater than a Walmart is able to offer to attract the customer into their store versus somebody going into a Walmart, right? So is their price cheaper? It may be. I don't have data in front of me to tell you, but possible.
One last question.
Yes, I was thinking about your steps. I was looking at your steps and they're valid. Well, one thing that seemed to be missing, maybe I missed the point, and that is the two things, flexibility of the management to change direction if needed. And the other is to really understand what the value is, what the value proposition is that you're delivering. If you don't really understand that, then it's very easy to be put off balance or think you're going in one direction as opposed to another. Speaking for myself, it's been a real struggle understanding what my core value that I'm delivering to my customer is. And unless I do that, then everything else is new.
Very good point. I mean, in my strategy work, you would be surprised how often we would answer or help companies answer the question of, what business am I in? Who is my customer? Right? These seem so obvious, right? But they're not. And companies that successfully establish a competitive advantage or create multiple competitive advantages in some cases, or able to sustain that over a long period of time, you will see that they go back and re-examine some of these basic questions on a very regular basis. Why? Everything around them is continually changing, right? And not only around them, internally, right? There may have been personnel changes, there may be technology changes. If they blindly follow a path without going back and re-examining these things, then you're right, that's exactly what can happen, right? They lose track of what is the value we're providing to the customer. What was valuable for the last 5 years, perhaps the marketplace has changed now, or something else is around where the value proposition is shrinking, right? So, exactly.